What's up, guys, and welcome to the Foot and Fist Sports Network. Today, we're going to be going over UFC 198's fight fallout. Basically, I'm going to talk about where the UFC and its fighters should go from after the most recent card. Let's go ahead and start off with the new heavyweight champion of the world, Stone Cold Stipe Miocic. Now, when it comes to Stipe, there are plenty of possibilities for his next matchup. You know, he hasn't taken on anybody in the top 5 apart from Junior dos Santos and Fabricio Werdum, who he just knocked out. So there are plenty of possibilities. More than likely, the UFC are going to wait until UFC 200 to see if Cain Velasquez beats Travis Browne. If Velasquez does win that fight, he is almost 100% the next opponent in line for the heavyweight title shot. If, however, he does lose, more than likely the UFC will opt with Alistair Overeem, who is on a pretty impressive winning streak with wins over Junior dos Santos and just last week, Andrei Arlovski in very decisive fashions. Both were knockouts. So either way, you know, Stipe does have, basically, he has a good idea of who his next opponent is going to be. Who has a little bit of a harder time right now is Fabricio Werdum, the former champ, who has lost to Junior dos Santos, albeit quite a few years ago. I think it was 2009. He's now lost to Stipe. So he is calling for a rematch, but it's going to be hard for the UFC to sell a rematch with somebody who was just knocked out in, 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, something like that. So it's not likely that the UFC are going to give him that rematch. Plus, you know, it was his very first title defense, so it's not like he had this win streak, this title defense streak that he can sort of push himself on to basically get himself a rematch. So more than likely, Fabricio Werdum is going to have to wait and see what happens at UFC 200 as well. If Cain does win, if Velasquez does win, then more than likely Fabricio is going to have to take on somebody like Junior dos Santos to basically decide who is going to be not Junior dos Santos, Alistair Overeem. The winner of that will more than likely take on the champion, so either Cain or Miocic at a later date. If not, if Velasquez somehow loses and Overeem does get the shot first, then I would expect to see Fabricio Werdum take on Junior dos Santos to then decide who is the number one contender after Overeem. So, as the same thing as with Miocic, both guys are going to have to wait until UFC 200 to have an idea of who their opponent is going to be. Next up, let's go ahead and talk about the co-main event. So Vitor Belfort, he took on Jacare Souza, and just like the Weidman fight, it was a very, very decisive loss. You know, things aren't looking great for Vitor. You know, he's had some tough matchups lately. His only win of late was against Dan Henderson, and everybody beats Dan Henderson nowadays. And age is definitely a factor at this point. You know, he's 39 years old, and he's been in the UFC since he was 20. So it's hard to see how Vitor is going to continue to get any better than he already is. I think he's probably already gone past his peak, and ever since TRT was banned, he's just getting worse and worse. So he should probably take on somebody who is lower down in the rankings. Somebody like maybe Uriah Hall, who was also supposed to be on this card, but his fight fell out due to Anderson Silva being injured. So both guys could come up against each other. It would be a chance for Vitor to take somebody who's lower ranked. It would be a chance for Uriah Hall to take on somebody who isn't quite as good as Anderson Silva, but is maybe of the same caliber name. And, you know, it would give Uriah Hall a chance to test himself against one of the bigger fighters in that division. Next up, let's go ahead and talk about Jacare Souza. You know, realistically, Jacare Souza is next in line for a title shot. Much like the Miocic situation, is really going to depend on what happens between Luke Rockhold and Chris Weidman. If the winner of that fight comes out healthy, then Jacare Souza could fight as soon as maybe, October, something like that. He could fight pretty soon. However, if the loser of that fight does come out, if the winner of that fight comes out, pretty beat up, then he might have to take on Michael Bisping to decide who is the actual number one contender, because Bisping is also on a good win streak. He just beat Anderson Silva, and it would be interesting to see the two of them go at it in a title eliminator and basically decide who is the actual number one contender. Next up, let's talk about Demian Maia. You know, he had one of those performances against Matt Browne that he's really had quite often lately. He seems to have turned into he's taken that next step in his career. He's taken a big step in his in his abilities, and just he's been dominating everybody from Demian Maia, from Gunnar Nelson to Neil Magny, now Matt Browne. It's really hard to not give him a title shot. Unfortunately for him, he's at welterweight. At welterweight there's Wonderboy Thompson, there's Rory McDonald, Tyron Woodley. All these guys are ahead of him in the line, and in fact, it's expected that Robbie Lawler will be fighting Tyron Woodley at UFC 201. And Stephen Wonderboy Thompson and Rory McDonald are actually having a title eliminator fight soon enough. I can't remember exactly what card it is. And the winner of that is going to be the next number one contender. So I don't think Demian Maia is going to be getting a title shot just yet. He's probably going to have to beat one more opponent to, really state his claim and give himself that undeniable factor that the UFC is going to have to take into consideration. Now, if you look at the rankings, there's not really one particular fighter in the top 5 or really even in the top 10 that makes a lot of sense for Demian Maia. He's either beaten them or they're booked. So what he's going to have to do is probably wait until Johnny Hendricks takes on Kelvin Gastelum. I think that's also at UFC 200. And the winner of that will maybe take on Demian Maia to sort of and that will probably be another title eliminator in the future. So basically time will tell what's going to happen for Demian Maia. I don't expect him to get a title shot next, but he will get one if he gets one more big win against a guy like maybe Johnny Hendricks, who was a big name, and somebody who just recently was competing for the title. Now let's talk about Matt Browne, who lost to Demian Maia. Now, Matt Browne is one of those guys who has a lot of ability, and he's just very, very tough. His only problem is that he seems to always lose against guys that are in the top 5. He's taken on Johnny Hendricks, Robbie Lawler, and now Demian Maia. Yeah, that's 3 of them. And he's lost every single one of them in very convincing fashion. He just doesn't seem to have that ability to keep up with that level of fighter. He has the toughness, he just doesn't seem to have the skill to match. And he is still, he's still pretty close. I think he's ranked number 8 right now, so it's not quite over for him. He still has time. I think he's probably going to need to take on somebody who's ranked around 7th or 8th or 9th, somewhere around him, somebody at the very end of the top 10. And somebody I would like to see him fight has to be Neil Magny, because I think both guys are very, very tough, and they always come out to bring it. Neil Magny, he's got great cardio, and you saw from his last fight against Hector Lombard. The guy can put on a very entertaining fight once he's pushed and once he's tested. So I think Matt Browne would bring out the best of him, and Neil Magny would also bring out the best in Matt Browne. I would love to see that fight as the opening fight of a pay-per-view card, say UFC 201 or something like that. Just give the fans something to look forward to as the first fight on the card, and I hope to see that fight happen in the near future. Next up, let's go ahead and talk about Cris Cyborg Justino. Big debut for Cyborg, something that everybody had been waiting for a very long time. Cyborg has talked about this one woman who is a murderer that can go out there and destroy Ronda Rousey back in the day, before Holly Holm and before Miesha Tate and all these. And basically it was before Ronda Rousey was sort of pushed to the side. And seeing her come out there and destroy Leslie Smith, who, with all due respect, isn't even in the top 10, in the top 15, excuse me, of the women's bantamweight division. It's still very impressive because she just toyed with her. She destroyed her. She did whatever she wanted. And there's no doubt that if Cyborg could make 135, then there's a good chance she could even be the champion there. However, she has been very open about the fact that she has no intention of leaving the women's featherweight division in Invicta, and she doesn't want to make 135. She doesn't want to leave her division, but she is open to super fights, which means eventually she's going to take on the Ronda Rouseys, the Miesha Tate, the Holly Holm. Well, at least the last 2, yeah. Ronda Rousey, probably not, because I don't think she's going to want to fight that much longer, and I'm not sure if she's going to want to fight a killer like Cyborg. But she will get these super fights. Cyborg will end up fighting against huge fights. Whether it's for a title or not, it doesn't really matter. It's just the fact that she needs to be in the UFC because she's one of the biggest names in women's fighting, and she really has no business being only in Invicta. With all due respect to Invicta, she needs to be in the UFC. And if super fights are the only way she can be in MMA's biggest brand, then so be it. Either way, it'll be very entertaining. Let's just go ahead and talk about Leslie Smith as well. You know, hats off to Leslie Smith for taking the fight. Cris Cyborg is somebody that nobody wants to fight. She's just such a monster. She always goes out there and seems to really hurt somebody. So, you know, it took a lot of balls, even though she doesn't have any, to take on Cyborg. And I think that the UFC is probably going to reward her for that. You know, you see a lot of times UFC gives fighters who aren't quite, you know, in the top 15 or top 10 or something like that, who do take a fight against a monster, and they give them somebody who is in the top 15, top 10 to give them sort of a chance to break into that, you know, into the rankings without having to go against somebody who is at the very top. So I'm expecting the UFC to give her an opponent that she could probably match up well with. And we all know how tough she is, you know, between taking the Cyborg fight and having her ear exploded against Jessica Ian, still winning the fight. We all know how tough this girl is. It's just a matter of, can she get the ability, the technical abilities, and just the fighting skills to match her toughness? We'll see. I'm not quite sure. I haven't really seen enough of her to know if she's going to be able to do that. I don't know how old she is either, so I don't know how much time she has to make those improvements, but hopefully, you know, for the sake of just how tough she is, she can sort of gain that gap and become one of the better fighters in the women's bantamweight division. All right, so all in all, UFC 198 was a pretty good card. I don't think it really quite reached the expectations that people had, because the last 3 fights on the card were very one-sided and they all ended pretty quickly, so we didn't really get to see these guys go at each other to the extent that we'd probably hoped for. But, you know, at the end of the day, it was a pretty good card. It was a very ambitious card from the UFC, putting an event in a 45,000 seater stadium, in Brazil. So yeah, hats off to them for doing that. That's it for the video, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like button. Please subscribe to the channel. Please let me know in the comment section down below if you thought Miocic had a lucky win. I personally don't think he did, but a lot of people seem to have thought that there was just a lucky punch. Let me know what you think. I look forward to seeing your answers. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.